Well, welcome to this brief moment of testimonies from people who have a connection with Newton Park. I'm very glad to be able to welcome the Reverend Ken Carr, who many of you know, who's at the Lorraine Methodist. And Ken has a long history with our church, and glad to have him. And Gavin Hancock's also a long history, and it's nice to have him with us all the way from the UK. And then John Gilmer, who is a part of our community. And John, it's lovely to see your face again. It feels like you could just as well be in the UK, but thank you for being with us. And tomorrow is we're actually recording this on Saturday. So tomorrow for us is Aldersgate Sunday. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for just some of us who have a connection with the Newton Park Church to, in broad terms, talk about how we met Jesus. My journey was meeting Jesus was really substantially, although obviously in my home, was substantially through the Newton Park congregation. I remember being at junior school and going along to a parking lot where Youth for Christ had set up some kind of evangelistic gathering, a parking lot near where Buttercup Bakery is now. And I remember going into a little caravan and making some kind of commitment to Jesus then. But obviously you're a child, and one's understanding, I think, grows and develops. I know that I've always loved Sunday school. I've always loved church. I've always felt a deep connection. And then when Dave Pedersen came to Newton Park Methodist as a probationer minister, he took us off on some wonderful camps and a real investment in us as young people. And so quite early on in his ministry there, it was an evening service at Newton Park. I remember the invitation was made to dedicate our lives, to commit our lives to following Jesus. And I think the call was to a fairly radical commitment. And I remember going forward to that communion rail in Newton Park and kneeling and offering my life to God. And it was it's always been, it was a turning point. It was a reference point. I can't say that I particularly felt my heart strangely warmed. I don't remember it as being a particularly emotional moment, but it was a significant moment. And if you ever ask me, when did I decide to follow Jesus? I would always refer to that moment in the early part of 1979. And for all the value of the history before that, that for me was my turning point. So if I had an Aldersgate moment, I think I would say that moment in March 79 was my moment. Gav, I wondered if you had a sense of your moment.
Yeah, thanks, Ro. It's really good to be with you and to share in this way across the miles. And it was so good to have been with you over Christmas as well, just to be part of everything while we were there for my mum's 90th birthday celebration. My experience that kind of immediately jumps to mind is not so much a conversion experience, but it's part of my ongoing journey. I had responded to the call to become a disciple through the ministry of the Living Sound when they were in Port Elizabeth in 1974. And it was shortly after that in the good old Founders Hall at Newton Park in the senior Sunday school. We were gathering or had gathered for our Sunday school session. We had our time of plenary worship to begin with, and we were heading towards our classes. And of course, I don't know if you might remember, I don't know if it was still the same when you headed in that direction, but I mean, it was just a huge cacophony of sound as chairs were shifted around and brought into circles, and we kind of got into our classes. And as that was all happening, I looked up, and there was a poster on the front wall, just above the door that used to go through to the kitchen. I don't know if it still does. On that poster, the connection had put out some posters that year, obviously trying to invite people to consider the ordained ministry. And I mean, the whole moment is just indelibly etched into my consciousness. And the picture had a cross, Bible, and a loaf of bread and a chalice on it. And the wording underneath at the bottom of the picture was, how do you know God's not calling you to the full-time ordained ministry in the Methodist Church of South Africa? And it was an amazing moment, because as I saw that poster, everything else just disappeared. And I was kind of left in this sort of almost like suspended animation, as it sounded like God was actually speaking the words to me, and they hit me like that. And I looked at it, and of course, I was 16 years old, and I kind of thought, what? Wow, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, okay, whatever. And then suddenly I was back in the middle of the noise, and got on with Sunday school, and I thought, what on earth was that all about? And in fact, at the time, I never told anybody. I didn't actually do anything about it. And it was only much later, in fact, when our journeys had connected through David Pedersen, and as in that year, I began to kind of explore my own recommitment and going back to what God had spoken to me that particular day, that I began to make sense of that moment. But it was just, well, just an amazing gift from God, an Aldersgate moment in my journey, if you like.
Thanks, Gav. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing, man. And I wondered if I could turn quickly then to Ken and ask Ken if he would share some of his story with us. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Rowan, and hello, people of Newton Park. It's a real privilege to be here, and it's such fun to be joining with Gavin. I haven't been on a one-on-one interface with Gavin for a long time. And those of you who remember Gavin in his youth will remember he had quite a prodigious head of hair. We're now busy arguing who's going to lose our hair faster. But I think Rowan wins that one. But my story goes back a long way with Newton Park, having grown up in Newton Park, being loved by a congregation and accepted as a child of that community. And just listening to the stories, it's interesting to hear moments of crossover, which I wasn't particularly aware of. Gavin mentions the living sound. I hardly remember that. I was still fairly young, but I remember apparently filling in a commitment form from that ministry. Just as a young child, something was starting over there. I'd been going to church, been going to Sunday school, but that challenge to become, to commit, to say this is deliberate, intentional. Fast forward a couple of years to another date that Rowan mentioned, 1979. We'd been overseas, and I'd returned back then when I was trying to find my way in a community. And I recall going on one of those epic camps that Rowan spoke about. And I remember we were challenged, as young people often are at camps like that, regarding our relationship with God. And I remember speaking to somebody. He wasn't from our church. He was probably a fellow student who had come along, university student who'd come along to help lead the camp. And when you want to talk about an Aldersgate experience, perhaps in some ways the similarity is there, not so much massive emotion, but for me that moment wasn't a come to Jesus moment, because I think Jesus had been part of my life up till then. But it was that moment of assurance, that sense of saying, Christ is in you, be assured of your salvation. Stop worrying and live in that confidence. And that simple moment became a transitional moment. There were many other moments, camps, a sense of calling to ministry, a sense of saying, God, I want to do something for you, the pleasure of serving in many areas in the life of the church. But I'm grateful for a community that has shaped me and formed me for who I am today.
Thank you, Ken, so much. And John, you have journeyed with us for a few years now, but you are also in a season of your life where you have served for many years as a Methodist minister. And so it would be lovely just to hear a bit of your story too today. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rowan, for the invite, and to be able to share with colleagues in this way is fantastic, but especially very warm greetings to the Newton Park congregation. or my family was based in Pretoria, and we weren't really a church-going family, but somewhere when I was about 4 or 5 years old, my mother decided that probably a good thing would be to get me and my brother off to Sunday school, and so that's how the whole story began. For me, God was an intellectual concept that I didn't really argue about, just was accepted. But most of my teenage years, I was a lot more interested in the scouting movement than in anything religious. We did go to church and Sunday school and so on, but it was just a formality really for me. And then, of course, a part of that formality was becoming confirmed. And so went to confirmation classes. I'm not sure I even today know what that was about really. And I really now feel very guilty about it, but also very sympathize with the poor minister who had me in his confirmation class. But part of being confirmed was going to a youth camp. And I tried everything in my power to avoid that. And perhaps God or the minister was very, very wise. And so I invited my parents to be the camp parents. So I couldn't avoid it and went along. And I guess I could say that that was my Aldersgate moment when God moved from being just an intellectual idea to being a living reality. I saw him, first of all, present in other people's lives, and at that camp invited him to be part of my life, and he became a reality to me. So that's very briefly my story. Thanks, Rowan.
Thank you, John, so much. And as we draw to a close, to say how fascinating, and I suppose not surprising, but how fascinating that our stories all originate in our youth. All four of us have that we are in ministry because of something someone did with teenagers, and that's a challenge to the church. Can I say thank you so much for joining us? Thank you for being part of this process, and may it be a blessing to those who hear it today. God bless you guys as you continue in your ministry and work.